Alright, can everybody in the back hear okay? Cool. I'm gonna not use a microphone, just so we can, move around the stage and do things a little easier.
You're a little close to the edge of the stage, so don't move around.
I was really young and never really watched it.
Alright, so we're gonna get started in about 5 minutes. Just a couple things for the panel. Basically, I'm going to be building a model live on stage and describing my process, the tools I'm using, and how you can do it too. It's a panel to encourage people to get into custom model building, so that's kind of the whole point of this. No matter your experience level, whether you've done this before or are into sculpture or into model making or haven't touched any of it, this is going to be kind of a primer on a process to give you some tools for self-expression in the custom model making space. So during the panel, feel free to ask any questions that pop into your head, no matter how basic, how advanced, whatever. And please feel free to come up, take a look around at the example builds I have here. They kind of show a bunch of the techniques that I'll be using and describing. And feel free to grab a business card. I'm in the Artist Alley all weekend, so you can come say hi, take a look at Kitbash stuff, talk about model making and Mecha design and all that fun stuff. And again, if you have any questions at all, please raise your hand and we can kind of point out, and I'll try to answer everything to the best of my knowledge. So just before we get started, I'll give a little intro to myself. And my name is John Salvino. I'm a artist, model maker, sculptor, kind of multi-faceted artist person. I like to do all this stuff. And I really like to do these demos and kind of get people into custom model making. So my intro to model making was just building kits, your pretty normal Gunpla stuff and all that. And then I worked professionally in sculpture for a while, did a little bit of custom model making for commissions and stuff, and I have a little bit of a process that I like to demonstrate for people so they can kind of repeat the steps and think kind of broadly about how to take their ideas and then turn them into three-dimensional objects. So like I said, please feel free to ask any questions, come up and take a look at the model kits. The wearing the wires up here if you walk around, grab a business card if you want to. And I think we're about ready to get started here. So, can everybody hear me? In the back, you okay? Cool. Is the screen nice and visible for everybody? As good as it can be. I know it's a little visually hectic right now.
If at any point he's not talking loud enough, make sure you yell. Just say, talk louder!
We're going to need the bell.
Yeah. Get aggressive on it.
Yeah. Let's make sure we have hot glue.
Yay!
Everything is solved.
Yeah, truly a philosophy for modeling. All right, so we are about at our starting time here.
Hey.
All right. So, what is kitbashing? Kitbashing is taking whatever, model kits traditionally, random scrap plastic, any material you can find, and using it to, in a sort of found object sculptural ways, create your design. Whether that is a completely original creation, whether that is a piece of fan art, a modification of an original design. Got a couple examples up here. The two guys with the big sword, the one with jousty arms, those are original designs. We got the big O over there. It's my little fan art piece that I made for this. A lot of people basically come to kitbashing to take their standard thing, tweak it a little bit, either to their custom preferences or to maybe make a show accurate thing that maybe they never made a kit of or things like that. Kitbashing actually started as train hobbyists making their own models of trains that no one was producing. Then went on to making the production models for Star Wars, things like that. So that's a little bit of the history of it. And what we're going to get into is more the sculptural side of things. So I'm going to be taking this armature here, which is just some 16 gauge wire glued to a base so I can kind of manipulate it in 3 dimensions. And we're going to be taking it along the process to something like that. So that's where we start. We start with an armature, we start with a concept. So for this, since we got a Ren Fair theme going this year for Zenkaikon, I'm going to go with like a knight, knight in shining armor kind of a look. Maybe a sword and board, big shield, big sword fighter, that kind of vibe. So I gave him a little pose, and we're going to be building on this armature, and I'll kind of explain the process and the tools I'm using, the materials as I go along. So I love kitbashing because you can get into it at a really easy entry level. Hot glue, some shears to cut things, some pliers to bend things, maybe some hobby nippers to just cut small stuff, and then whatever you got lying around. We have window blinds, we have wire, we have model kit parts, we have some cloth, little piece of string. All this stuff is useful for kitbashing. So basically, we're going to be improvising the design as we go, and I'll explain some of my design process ideas while we do this. So once you have your concept, we're going to do a knight, all right? And then we have an armature. This knight is going to be in this pose. It's going to be shield forward, holding the sword backward, about to swing it. Then you start thinking, what are the big shapes of that design? What are the keystone pieces that whoever's looking at this is going to see first, that's going to define what it looks like for them? So that's probably going to be a big, heavy shield, a cool-looking sword, maybe a nice helmet. The key pieces that are going to visually tie this thing together. And so we're going to sort through our big Lego bin of random stuff here and start building those out. So I'm looking through, and I'm looking for, first let's do the shield. So we got little pieces like this, kind of broad circular pieces with interesting little detailing on them. I'm going to use a couple of those as our base. Yeah.
Just sort it out and all of the pieces and stuff.
Yeah. And since this shield is basically a prop for our guy to hold, I'm going to be building it separately, and I'll glue it on after the fact, so we can build his arms and other stuff without the shield getting in the way. To get things started, I just use really simple building techniques. Just find nice big pieces, glue them together as best you can. Sometimes I'll kind of flood a cavity with hot glue if I need to. Sometimes I'll just put it on the rim of an object. I like working with hot glue when I'm doing a fast build like this because you can build forwards and backwards. You can put stuff together, or you can easily tear it apart if you're not satisfied with how it's looking, or if you want to redo something, or need to rework it for whatever reason. If you are getting serious into this and you want to build something that's going to last really long or be a little more stable than hot glue, you can use your more traditional like super glue or epoxies or other adhesives. But for this process, I like to work fast, I like to work a little loose, and kind of think of it as a three-dimensional sketch. Kind of a concept art in 3 dimensions. All right, so I have a little bit of a base for the shield here. I'm going to build up a little more bulk around it. So I think I want this guy to have kind of like a tower shield, like one of those tall shields. And when you're working with hot glue, especially if you're working fast, it's always good to lay things flat, let them set, work on something else while they're drying so you're not having pieces flop around, fall apart while you're building them. That can be a big frustration point for a lot of people getting into the hobby. Hot glue is probably the fastest way to work like this, so that it alleviates some of the frustration if you start there. If you're working with epoxy or super glue and stuff, probably have to let things wait a little bit longer. All right, and I'm thinking as I'm building this shield about how the knight uses it. Is it mounted to a gauntlet? Is it held in a handle? Is it wrapped around? trying to think of the mechanics of like how this thing works. So I'm looking and finding some piping. I think maybe you'll put that on the back of the shield as kind of a clamp that holds it to his arm. And I think it's always important whenever you're doing any kind of sculptural design or any design really, it's always important to think through your design. Think how it would work if it were a real, designed object in 3 dimensions that people actually use. Where are the hinges? How do they work? What's powering it if it's moving? How does it stay on? What's fastening it? If it's armor, what kind of armor is it? Is it scale? Is it plate? Is it something more futuristic? Is it flexible? Is it rigid? These kind of things you always want to keep in mind, because the more you pay attention to that stuff, even if you're only working on like the 2-dimensional or stationary pieces, it's going to be more convincing for the viewer when they see the thing. It's going to be more, build more visual interest. So right now I'm basically just putting these big plates together, lining the edges with hot glue, and placing them as symmetrically as I can by eye. If I weren't doing this live on stage, I'd probably be very careful about measuring these things. But I think for these purposes, it's fun to be a little fast and loose with it. And if you are just doing this to like get a concept across, you can always go back and rework it as the beauty of this material. Of course, when you're kit bashing, you can never be precious with the stuff. Don't be afraid to cut things carefully, of course. It's hard to cut, probably don't cut it. I'm just measuring the parts against each other right now to make sure that I'm making a symmetrical cut. Same thing, just lining the edges with glue. The other nice thing about hot glue is that you can pretty easily go back with the tip of the gun, smooth things out, give it a little bit of texture if you want, kind of sculpt the hot glue. Whereas with other adhesives, once they're dry, you pretty much have to get in there with a sander, maybe some putty, and work things out that way. All right, there we go. Got a nice base for our tower shield. So let's think about a sword. So right now I'm looking for something to be a handle, like long, thin parts. I think these are cannons from a Zoid kit. It's funny, when you start doing this, you kind of like recognize every little piece in your bin of thousands of parts.
Yeah, you somehow always know what every piece came from.
I tore them apart. So I'm doing this on a little bit of a small scale here, but this is something you'll often have to do with kit bashing. There's a peg here that was designed, to hold pieces of the kit together, and I'm just going in with nippers and clearing it out, kind of just clear cutting everything on the inside so they are able to be put up flush against each other. That's a pretty common thing you have to go through with stuff like this, because obviously kit parts are designed with pegs and holes and all other stuff to help them join together and work the way they were designed to. But when you're kit bashing, you just sort of bulldoze over all of that stuff. Unless you're being fancy and making an articulated kit bash, and that's a lot more complicated. But basically the difference is just the amount of time you spend on it. All right, so this will be the base for our sword. Maybe it'll have a long handle and stick out like that. And then we'll build a blade on top of it. I'm also going to go ahead and reinforce that joint a little bit. Since it's just those two pieces glued together in the middle, I'm going to put something kind of across the center to bridge them. That'll give it a little bit more structural integrity, so if I decide to build more of a blade, hopefully it won't fall apart on us. And whenever you're building with these like semi-permanent materials, like hot glue and stuff, you want to be, even with other materials, you want to just think of good principles of like engineering. So this is just one point of contact here. The more points of contact, the more stable. So what I'm going to do is put a string of glue here and a string of glue here. And we're going to bridge this on the front and on the back. So that gives it way more points of contact, and it's going to be way more stable. And we might even go in and fill that in a little bit more once it's cool. So like I said before, I'm just going to leave that off to the side to dry while I work on another part. I'm going to start filling out the body of our knight here. So I'm going to go into my bin, dig out some bulkier pieces to kind of fill in the torso. Because usually I start that way. The torso, biggest part of the human body, it's the first thing you're going to see, first thing your brain sees anyway when you look at a person, just because it's, takes up the most space. So your eye goes right to it, so you want to make sure that it looks the way you want to if you're sculpting. I'm going to start with some kind of big chunky pieces here and build it out. And as I'm going, I'm just making sure, like I said before about points of contact, to just create as many points of contact between the armature and the plastic as I can before those areas get covered up with other pieces. And that way, this guy will have the best chance possible of just being nice and sturdy, and we won't have to worry about it falling apart. So we're starting to get a chest and maybe a little bit of a backpack shape. These pieces are relatively big, putting them in by hand. Once we get to smaller stuff, I might move on to pliers, just to get a little bit more accuracy, since this armature is relatively small, especially compared to builds like that that are pretty sizable. And when you're planning out whatever you're building, you always want to consider the size and scale of everything. So I'm thinking this knight isn't just going to be a regular knight, it's going to be like a giant robot knight. I love giant robots. Let's make him a giant robot knight. So as we're building out these kind of basic steps, what I think I'm going to do is consider what things I can do to make a tiny little model feel like a giant robot. What are the things that impart scale to it, that imply that this thing's huge? So that would be, recognizable things that a human would interact with, maybe a car or a ladder or a hatch. Things like that where we know what scale they are. And when we look at this thing, we see, oh, the hatch is that big, that means the pilot has to go in there, that means this thing's 40 feet tall. All right, now that we've got a little bit of bulk on the torso, I'm going to start building out the hips, the legs, the arms. Just kind of keep going until we have kind of the basic form of our guy here. And just keep in mind those keystone pieces that we talked about, the big defining shapes of the build. As you're doing that, and as you're putting these big pieces down, you want to make sure that you leave a little bit of kind of hollow areas. You can kind of see me through there. You want to leave a little space between things, because your next step is going to be your underlayer of details. So you have your keystone pieces that define the form, and then an underlayer of details that are like, think of them as the mechanics, the pistons, the joints, the skeletal frame of everything. All those little things that once the build is complete kind of peek through and lend that like visual credibility that there's like a real machine under there. but there's moving parts, that there's design involved. And that, for me, is like the most fun part of kitbashing, but it is also very tempting to get completely lost in those details. It's kind of like hypnotizing, you can spend hours just running wires through your guy or putting hydraulic pistons on every joint or things like that. It can be really satisfying, but it can take a lot of time. But if you really pay attention during that phase, you can get a design across that is pretty cool and very visually interesting and can be convincing and convey a lot of intent behind your design. So when I was building that big O model, in the show, that mech is very minimalist and kind of intentionally under-designed just for stylistic purposes. And I thought, for my interpretation, I want to increase the complexity of it and rethink how the design works. So I added a lot of mechanical details that kind of contradict the original design, but also imply different ways of functioning. So for instance, in the show, the Big O has these two gigantic piston arms, and they just punch and they look crazy. They're awesome. And in my version, I added little mechanical pumps on the side that maybe imply that those drive the pistons or something. So I wanted to, create a little bit of difference and a reinterpretation. So we're starting some details on the arms here. Whenever you're building in 3 dimensions, it's always really important that you check your work in 3 dimensions. You don't just build from one perspective the entire time. You want to be rotating this thing around. You want to view it from all angles, because whoever's looking at a sculpture is going to be looking at it from all angles. And you want to be kind of predictive and catch weird stuff that might crop up that you're not noticing if you're only viewing it from one direction. You also, as you're building, want to make sure you go in and reinforce things. That's very important. You don't want to be stuck with some of your internal pieces rattling around, or key parts falling off when you're not anticipating them to, or worse, building off of parts that aren't properly secured. So we're just going in and reinforcing a little bit. So to get some bulk on this guy's legs, what I'm going to do is take some wire and some sprue, just kind of bulk material. So the sprue is the little runners that are between all the model kit parts that we all have a million of if we're builders, and some wire, just because it's a nice, consistent cylindrical shape. Might even incorporate that little fray at the end for some added detail. And I'm going to run those along little portions of the legs to build up some bulk, and then what we'll do is cut a little notch in these pieces, these hollow cylindrical pieces, and kind of slide them over the legs to give it that kind of outer shell. And as I'm building, I just habitually kind of create symmetrical pairs of things, whether that's sorting parts in my bin into symmetrical bins, or actually cutting out symmetrical pieces of sprue while I'm working. It's just always nice to know that you have a mirror pair of something if you're working on a symmetrical design. And that's a good principle of design to keep in mind as well, of symmetry. Whether you're adhering to symmetry or breaking symmetry. So usually I stick to about something that's 80% symmetrical and 20% asymmetrical. If it's 100% symmetrical, it looks boring. There's something subconscious in your brain that just registers that it's a mirror image and that it's just kind of the same on both sides. But if there are little asymmetries throughout. The viewer can pick up on those, and it builds a little bit of interesting contrast between the two sides of the object. And in this one, we also have a little bit of an asymmetrical pose, so that's going to help us there too. You can also approach symmetry from the other end and make something that's like wildly asymmetrical with some interesting congruities between the two sides. Put those pieces of wire in. Maybe I'll include that piece of frayed wire on one leg, like he got hit or something. It's busting out. And as I'm going on here with hot glue, I just apply a very small amount, just enough to get it tacked on there. That lets it cool faster, lets me build a little quicker, it's easier to remove it and go back. And you'll get used to working with hot glue and kind of getting just the right amount out of the gun the more you work with this stuff.
Don't use too much or you'll melt it.
Yeah, if you end up kind of flooding it with hot glue, things will fall apart. I also recommend, if you're going to use this method, to get like one of these fine tip guns. They make the whole process a lot easier. You have a question?
Do you find hot glue to be like the best solution in general?
It's very easy to do a lot of things with it, but it has some significant drawbacks. It's a thermoplastic for one, so those guys are probably not going to be great in the summer. It won't adhere to a lot of stuff, especially if it's smooth. So if you're building with the intent of making a kit that's going to last a long time, you really want to like rough up the surfaces before you glue things to them. Like I said, it's easy to work backwards with it, but it's also not nearly as strong as a lot of other adhesives. So I would say it's a good, for this like kind of concept building where you're not necessarily building something to last forever, but just to get an idea across, it's great. But for a more permanent display piece, I would recommend spending the time to use a more permanent adhesive.
And like scoring would do something? Is that possible?
It does help. Yeah, I actually scored the base here because this wire is very, it's like perfectly smooth, and then this base is also very smooth. So I scored it, and the wire is adhering much better than it would if I had not done that.
Do you have a question?
I wanted to ask what your budget per month is on hot glue.
The great thing about hot glue is it's very cheap.
Yeah.
So yeah, I basically bought like a bulk container probably like 3 years ago.
Yeah, you can get really big cases of those.
And I still am like working my way through that. I think I'm only like halfway through, and I use a fair amount of hot glue. I mean, not as much as like cosplayers and stuff. I'm not running like 6 foot beads of it at a time. So I think $16 is my.
Spend it on over 3 years, that's golden.
Yeah, well that's the lovely thing about kitbashing. You can get started with a very low budget if you want to. And so, I mean, I really recommend it as a nice accessible way to get into model making, especially custom stuff. And I kind of come at it from an artistic perspective rather than like a model making perspective, but I think it's valid for both interests. And there's, I think there's a lot of room to grow in the like three-dimensional arts community around like anime fans, and there's a lot of like people that are getting into this hobby now, and it's kind of it's fun to see it blowing up as an interest. All right, so we have those little cylindrical bulk things on the legs, and we're starting to get a little bit of a silhouette for our guys. Got kind of some shoulder armor here, some hips, some knees. So we're going to continue bulking him out a little bit, and then we'll start adding in those underlayer details I was talking about before. So since I was thinking of this being a knight in plate armor, I'm also considering, the source of the concept. What is plate armor? It's a bunch of plates layered over and fastened to each other. So I'm also thinking of, how to replicate that look as I'm building this guy. So a lot of little plates that look like they're meant to fit together, things that cover up weak points in the anatomy, joints, guts, head, all that kind of stuff. Even if it's like a mech, you want it to visually represent those things. And honestly, I guess the principles would be the same. A mech is probably going to be just as vulnerable in its joints relatively as a human would be. It's always good to think of those conceptual ideas as you're building, so you don't wind up with something that looks cool, but upon closer inspection doesn't really make any sense. I always find it better when, even if you're just doing something for the aesthetics, there's a little bit of attention paid to kind of the logic of how it works.
You mentioned earlier that part of your benefit is was doing commissions for other people.
Yes.
In regards to your building, kitbashing, and final product, were you ever thinking about the steps that would be required for painting a model like this, or for kind of moving it past just the base build?
Yes. So that's a really good question. The kind of like end product you desire is very important to your initial steps when you plan your build. And that applies to, the forms as well as coloration, stability, all those sorts of things, the materials you're using. I did a commission where I built these like airship models, and they were for a film, so I knew they had to be like painted and look like, one of them was like a real ship that actually exists in real life, but with like a hot air balloon and some airship steampunk junk on it. And so I had to consider how I would color it to look like the real ship, how it would match with, because they went filmed on the real ship for this little like indie movie, and I wanted it to match. So that was a concern, definitely. I also had to make sure that it would like not fall apart under stage lighting and moving around on a camera rig and stuff. So there was like metal involved in that one. Another like structural thing. So these guys, they all have big wire armatures, and the guy with the sword and the really like crazy dynamic pose, his legs are welding rod, like 1/8 inch thick metal. So it's very sturdy. You always want to think ahead a little bit if you're planning on doing something that looks like it's kind of defying gravity and things like that. Also, the tip of the sword is like really light foam, so he's not doing this over time.
Yeah, with painting, you're not typically one to do kind of finished detail work with the painting.
Yeah, my interest is much more in like the form and design area of this stuff. I mean, I admire the people that take, their builds to like presentation level, and that's a whole skill in and of itself, a whole like area of expertise that I don't really have a ton of things to say about. But I mean, honestly, I think like there's nothing in this process that prohibits a like showpiece level paint job necessarily. It's all just about the amount of time you spend refining things. Giving this guy kind of a sci-fi HR geeker backpack looking thing here.
And for anyone just joining, just raise your hand or shout it out if you have any questions or want to know anything about what's happening here.
And like we said before, feel free to come up, take a look at the models, ask any questions that pop into mind, grab a business card, all that stuff. Start adding the underlayer. So all the cool little fiddly bits that make them work, or at least look like they do. So for the underlayer of detail, I really like to use string, wire, thin plastic, stuff that's flexible, so you can kind of feed it through hollow areas, you can bend it to shape, you can fit it, in areas that you maybe weren't thinking about before. It's nice to have that flexibility when you're adding this, these kind of components to your build. And generally when you're working with kind of a humanoid form, you really want to be like referencing human anatomy and human biomechanics and stuff whenever you can. So you're thinking about like muscle sinew and large muscle masses, things like that, skeletal structure, those sorts of visual features that come through on a human body.
Do you tend to do any pre-design, or do you just hop right into the model making what you stuff?
So, I guess it's hard for me to answer because like I'm always drawing robots and stuff, and that's just like going on in my brain. But if I'm like particularly going after a concept, I'll usually do a fair amount of pre-design work. But for a lot of my builds, I just go like the sword guy, the lance guy. Those are just sort of make a general pose with the armature and have fun. The big O, I did a little bit more design ahead of time just because I wanted it to like be recognizable and have some of those like intentional divergences from the original design that I had thought about. And obviously if I'm working on commission like with the airships and stuff, that involves a lot more pre-design because they had engineering requirements. They needed to not fall over, not melt, not do a lot of things. They had to sit there and look nice and not do that.
And you've also made posable ones before, and that takes a lot of
That's the most
engineering
pre-designed.
design.
Yeah. So one of my first kit bashes was a forklift with legs, and it was really fun to build. I learned a lot doing it. I would definitely do it differently if I did it now. But one of the interesting concerns was once I had finished it, it sort of fell over anytime you put anything in the forklift, and so I had to like counterweight it with like a big chunk of like metal basically at the back. Just sort of like hollowed out a cavity in the back and filled it with metal, and that counterbalanced it. But when you're building an articulated armature, not only do you have to figure out the joints and make sure they work under the right pressures, but also like just engineer the overall weight of the thing and make sure it can be posed and keep a stable pose, and just all that technical stuff that is very complicated and takes a long time and involves more thought into your materials and your build than this kind of stuff.
I feel like you've run the whole gamut between like just making things up as you go, and then you also have like the garage kit that you have been working on for a while. Involves a lot of like blender and 3D modeling and figuring out the logistics that way.
Basically like a fully designed product and stuff. So right now I'm basically taking this little cord and kind of winding it through this. And that's literally creating tension and tying things together, but I think it's also visually making a connection between like the backpack and the front of the character. So the eye is going to be drawn along the course of that string. And it kind of invites you to explore the design as you're looking at it. You always want to be thinking about the way your viewer is going to like move their eye around the piece. So you want to create like an interesting three-dimensional composition when you're doing this stuff. More bits of that underlayer detail, piping and other little small visually interesting pieces. So for this pose I have one leg that's a little more outstretched and one leg that's kind of bent. So what I'm going to do here is add these little pieces, and I'm going to pretend they're like hydraulics or something. So on the bent leg, what I'm going to do is trim it a little bit shorter, so it looks like it's actually in motion, being compressed. And I'll leave the one for the longer leg at full length. And that's going to imply some function in this thing. You always want to be thinking when you're building machines, like especially if it's a stationary sculpture, a stationary build, you want to imply how this thing moves, how it works, because you can't actually, demonstrate it and actually move the parts around. So you want to show the viewer how it works by your posing, your detailing, putting, two identical arms in different poses and see how they look different in those different poses. Right now I'm adding a couple of pieces that are going to be kind of crossing over, twisting around in this guy's anatomy. And again, that's going to just add that visual interest and kind of guide the eye from this side through into here. Doing the same thing, trimming one side shorter than the other since it's kind of in more compression than the other side is. Just adding little glue tacks at the end points so it sticks nice and fast. And we're going to go in and just make sure everything we've added so far is nice and stable before we get to the next step.
It's 3:21. We have till 8:45. That's tempting.
When you're building a piece like this, it's really helpful to have it on a base, so you can rotate it in 3 dimensions really easily without actually having to manipulate kind of structurally weaker parts of your build. Like, it's always terrifying if you're like having something like this and holding it by the foot and kind of rotating it around like that. It's always nice to have a good sturdy base to work off of.
And then you can choose to build terrain on it and stuff like that if you want to get more into like a scene too.
Yeah, make it
like for that, the big guy with the sword down there, you made kind of like a bridge that had fallen in and some like highway scenery.
Yes, just all visual storytelling to kind of give some context to your build. A couple more bits of detail, and then we can start the next phase, which I would call it the overlayer, and that's kind of with mechanical design, kind of the plating, what do you call it, like auto body, the body work basically, the big plates that cover everything, and the paneling, that kind of stuff that gives the overall form that you're gonna see when you look at this thing.
Where is it? Where is it?
This one?
Yeah, what is that?
Anyone guess what this is? Pizza table.
Thought it looked familiar.
Yeah, I think it's a master grade. 144 scale pizza. Alright, I think the arms are looking a little anemic here, so I'm going to add a little bit of detail to them, and then we'll move on to that overlayer. I'm going to put some more armor plates on this guy, get maybe a helmet shape going.
It's crunch time.
Crunch time.
I like watching you glue fast.
Glue fast, the same card. take these big, chunky pieces. I think these are shoulder plates to something. And I'm going to cut them down and make this kind of conical shoes that is in some old plate armor pieces. I think that's a nice like iconic look that some medieval armor has. Just thinking in very basic geometric forms at this stage. So it's conical, making little triangles, going to build on top of them to get the general form. And I'm always keeping symmetrical pieces on hand so I can go back and make similarly shaped objects. If I want like one piece on the inside, one piece on the outside, same on the other foot. Try to make something similar on the other side. Again, with this sort of fast building process, I'm not aiming for like perfect symmetry, but just something that is recognizably the same. There we go. Let that cool for a minute. And so when I build this small, for really detailed things like hands, feet, faces, you either want to rely on pre-built parts, or in this case, I think I'm going to give them kind of like a visor helmet, so I'm not spending a bunch of time trying to work eyes and the mouth and all that kind of stuff out. And for hands, I might go with that pre-built stuff, or maybe he's got like the clamps or something. I'm also starting to think about the end of the build and how I want to add little details, maybe like fuel tanks or power cells, or like I think that's like a little flare gun or something. Just little touches you can add at the end. So I think I'm going to give this guy like cuffs around the wrist, and then that'll let me attach whatever kind of apparatus I want to at the hand. And I'm probably going to build the hand right on the sword handle, so I'll have an easy time kind of attaching all of that all in one go. I'm going to add some plate to the leg here, and this is just vinyl window blinds. Very helpful model making tool if your cat happens to salmon ladder up your blinds and wreck them.
You've gotten so much use out of those blinds.
It's provided me with years of material.
Wait, who's the true artist? Who are the cat?
Oh?
That's a debate to be had. I'm sure I know the cat's answer. So what I was doing right there was forming the blinds around the curve in my pliers. Just a nice little fabrication technique to get curvature without cracking the vinyl. Usually when you're kit bashing, you don't work with a ton of flexible parts, but it's always nice to have a little bit of malleability. Shoring up everything on the legs here. And I think I'm going to fill in some of those gaps in the torso instead. So you can see our progress.
Yeah, a little under 15 minutes left, I think.
All right, 15 minutes. We're kind of in the home stretch here. So as you can see, we've got our basic shapes defined here. I'm going to start working on the details, get the head figured out, the hands, get these props put on them. Oh, we can make him a pyramid head.
Illuminati.
Keep zooming in, we'll find the triangle.
What is that? That is it's a base from Ikaruga, I think. Yeah, the ship from Ikaruga. So on the armature, I built a little ring shape for the head so I would have something to kind of thread it through to mount whatever I was going to use for the helmet. But I made it a little too wide. I'm going to take the pliers and kind of pinch it. There we go. I found a nice piece here that I like. It's going to be like Cyclops. So that'll be the face, so I'll build a helmet around that. Every time I get to this stage, I've got to concentrate. Sometimes if I'm building something with a really big prop that I know I'm not going to need to remove, I'll build the armature out so it can go into the prop and support it. I think this will be okay without it. But for instance, on the big sword guy, that wire runs through the hands up into the tilt of the sword. All in the interest of it not falling apart on a car ride. Go back to those vinyl pieces because they're nice and easy to cut. If you ever get to the end of a build, there's usually a lot of spaces that are oddly shaped, and you can spend a bunch of time sorting through your parts, and you might find something that works, but sometimes it's nice to just cut the exact shape you need if you're short on time. You ever find yourself on stage trying to complete a model in an hour and a half?
In an hour.
An hour.
And for pieces like the big O, you sculpted the top of the head out of clay because you couldn't find anything.
Yeah, and Katsucon was in 2 days.
Yeah, couldn't finish it.
Yeah.
So you can use all kinds of mixed media things. Anything you can get your grubby little hands on.
You ever custom model and 3D print anything?
Yeah, I got into it a little bit. So I do like 3D modeling like professionally, and that was my foray into that. I don't do like character work, it's like architectural stuff. But yeah, that was kind of like, I don't know, something I'm looking to get more into. I haven't done a ton of it.
You 3D printed, there's little tiny chibi versions of the hammerhead kind of robot up front here. Everybody can come by and take a look, and you 3D printed and then resin? Made
Yeah,
a resin?
I made a 3D printed original and then silicone mold and resin cast.
But yeah, so you've done some of that. And then for the garage kit that you were working on, that was toyed with maybe 3D printing parts for that.
Yeah.
Or like, you know, having a kit that people could buy of an original design. But that's been on the back burner for a while now, but.
Yeah, it definitely is a resource intensive process.
Yeah.
And time intensive.
And we have a resin 3D printer, and I know there was a lot of like learning curve, like a lot of things that you needed to kind of like figure out
Yeah.
with it too. Like, it's not as easy as just like. Oh, I could have put this on the camera thing.
Yeah.
He's a little buddy. It's just a little thick boy. Hi, Shannon. Yeah, a little under 10 minutes.
Alright, so we're wrapping up details here. I'm going to put some more kind of big, bulky armor plates on this guy. And then we'll put the shield on, finish up the sword. And at this point in the presentation, please, if you guys have any questions, if you want to come up, take a look at the models, grab a business card, that kind of stuff, feel free to do that. I don't know exactly what is going on after this panel, but I think we might have to leave the room. So.
Oh yeah.
No,
But be not afraid.
Yes. And also, if you want to talk model making stuff or design any of that stuff, I'm in the artist alley all weekend. Feel free to come say hi after the panel if you see me walking around.
Oh, and everybody should go to Fargo Co. while you're here this weekend. That's our friend's game shop. And it's the best shop on earth, and I love it there. And you can also visit them in the dealer room. And us in the artist alley.
That's
a good way to get involved.
So, usually the way I go about it is sometimes model shops have a lot of back stock that are like broken kits or things like that they're either they don't know what to do with or they're trying to get rid of or whatever. You can also just hit up your friends who are in the hobby. That's usually a guaranteed way to get a bunch of random pieces.
Yeah, once you become known as somebody who's into kitbashing, people will literally just give you stuff. Some very nice person came and gave us like some model kits. Literally right before we got here, they were like, "Oh, you're doing a kitbashing panel? Here's some old model kit pieces I'm not using." So once people know that you're into it, you will have to like literally right before I was like, "This came off of the thing I'm wearing. Like, here, you take this. This is your piece of random trash plastic now." But yeah, like asking game shops, anywhere that has model kits, any of your friends that do model kits, like ask them for their scraps. What was that? No, but
so usually what happens is if a shop specializes in kits, they'll have stock that either came in damaged or just hasn't sold in 5 years or whatever, and they're like, okay, this is just, they put it in the back and forget about it.
or people who just don't want their kits anymore. Also, like, sometimes you can get lucky in thrift stores or on Mercari, things like that.
I actually, so usually when I paint, it's these bigger ones, and I go with just some acrylic craft paint, just to like get it done, and it's presentable, it's totally fine. I wouldn't call this like show finish, but it's, it gets the color scheme across and shows off the color and stuff.
I think it matches with your work also.
Yeah, I tend to go toward like the golden black look and that kind of thing.
Yeah, you do like a spray paint base, and then go into the dry. And we do, if you live locally, Fargo Co. has mini painting nights. So a lot of the times we go on the mini painting nights, we do kit bashing as well. And like sometimes hate things also, because you know, it's,
Yeah.